Hi, I'm Marta Stuckel. I am a PhD student at the University of Minnesota, and I'm a science teacher at Tartan High School just outside of St. Paul. And I'm going to talk a little bit about my work on underrepresentation and self-assessment in AP Physics 1. So first, I'm working with the physics identity framework developed by Carlone and Johnson. And they identified 3 key dimensions for a student to identify as a physics person. And those are competence, performance, and recognition. Now, physics identity matters because it's been shown to be an important predictor of a student's intention to persist in physics or in closely related fields. There's also a lot of evidence that women, especially women of color, are less likely to report a physics identity than their white male peers. Now, I'm particularly interested in the recognition dimension, and this is the student seeing themselves as a science person. This can be both internal and external. I'm particularly interested in that internal component of recognition, which includes confidence and self-efficacy, where self-efficacy is the student's belief in their capacity to succeed, and then confidence is their perceptions of their achievement. Now, typically, confidence ends up being a precursor of self-efficacy, so these two ideas are very closely related. Now, looking in particular at internal recognition in the form of confidence, women frequently have a lower confidence in physics than men. There's also evidence that the confidence of students can decline during an introductory college physics course, with women's tending to decline more. And men tend to have more confidence even when they have similar achievement as the women in their classes. Now, all of these studies have been done at the college level, which is important to note. So my first research question is there a similar confidence gap between boys and girls at the high school level? So the way I looked at this, I examined AP Physics 1 classroom at a suburban public high school. This course is a 12th grade elective. The curriculum is based on modeling instruction, and students take weekly standards-based assessments. So there's a set of standards that describe particular skills or knowledge that students need to master, and they receive feedback for those specific pieces of knowledge and skills. Now, the AP Physics 1 course at this school tends to be about 36% girls and about 31% students of color. This does stand in contrast to the school overall, which is about 50% girls and 56% students of color. Now, the study itself is a mixed methods self-study, so I am looking at my own classroom. There's been 2 years of data collection so far and 3 major data sources. First are assessment scores and quantitative self-assessments. Next was an open-ended self-assessment prompt, and then finally student interviews. So for the quantitative components, the self-assessment is something included on all course assessments. And this is something that was collected for both years of the study, so a total of 92 students. So at the end of each assessment, there was a listing of all of the standards, so all of the specific skills and knowledge that was being assessed, and students were asked to rate how well they thought they scored on each assessment. Those student ratings and their actual scores were then both recorded. These scores were then used to map onto a CCL Confidence-Achievement Window, which sorts students into 4 profiles based on relationships between their confidence and achievement. And so the blind profile is used to describe low confidence and high achievement. The public profile describes high confidence and high achievement. The hidden profile is high confidence but low achievement, so students who are overconfident in their performance. And then the unknown profile is students who have both low confidence and low achievement. So looking at the results from this study, the red triangles represent girls, the blue dots represent boys. These are based on an average of all of the self-assessments and all of the actual scores over the course of the year. The majority of students fell into the unknown profile, which is low confidence and low achievement, or into the public profile, which is high confidence and high achievement. These two profiles can be described as having a high degree of calibration, since students have a fairly accurate level of confidence compared to their achievement. There's a lot fewer students falling into the blind and hidden profiles, where there's a mismatch between the confidence and the achievement. Now, while there are more boys falling into the public and the unknown profile than girls, that is an artifact of simply having a larger number of boys than girls in the course. And so across both genders, students fell into each profile at fairly similar rates. So this leads to my next research question. What kinds of classroom experiences influence student confidence? What led students to have this fairly well-calibrated sense of confidence overall? So to answer this question, I looked at my qualitative data sources, and there were two that I used. The first were student interviews. These were conducted at the end of year 2 with a total of 10 students, 4 girls, 6 boys, 7 white students, and 3 students of color. This demographic distribution is fairly similar to the overall course demographics this year, though it is important to note all of these students were volunteers, which suggests that the students I interviewed probably had relatively positive feelings towards the course. The other qualitative data source I used was a self-assessment prompt. During year 2, as part of the self-assessment that students completed, they were asked, if you believe you are at mastery, what strategies or actions helped? If not, what will you do to improve? The student responses to this were transcribed on each assessment that year with a total of 51 students. Both of these were analyzed using emergent thematic analysis, and so I reviewed the student responses to look at what common themes, in particular what kinds of classroom experiences were students tending to raise on the self-assessment and on the interviews. So there were two major things I want to talk about today that seemed to matter a lot. The first is external recognition, both from peers and from the teacher. The second is guided inquiry labs. So on external recognition from peers, there was a big difference in the way that girls and boys talked about that. These two quotes are excerpts from student interviews. On the left, the response from the boy is one that was fairly common from male students. When boys tended to talk about their peers thinking they were pretty good at physics, and talked about experiences like their peers asking for their ideas and listening to their suggestions. Now, girls spoke very, very little about those peer interactions during the interviews. This girl that's quoted is in fact the only one. Now, she referenced some similar experiences with peers asking for her ideas, listening to her suggestions, but she believed that her peers were overestimating her abilities, which tells me that even though she had some similar experiences to the boys who were interviewed, she was interpreting those experiences in very, very different ways. External recognition also came from the teacher in ways that students talked about. This was something that students primarily talked about during the interviews and was not as apparent on the self-assessments, since the self-assessments were a part of the quizzes that students were taking. Boys tended to link recognition from the teacher with demonstrations of competence. They talked about having good grades. They talked about quizzes where they had done well. Girls, by contrast, very, very consistently in the interviews, talked about quizzes where they didn't necessarily show competence. They talked about constructive criticism. They talked about feedback that helped them understand what they did incorrectly. And so for the girls that were interviewed, they were able to separate external recognition from demonstrations of competence. Guided inquiry labs were also an important emergent theme. This is one that appeared very consistently on both the open-ended self-assessment response and is something that students talked about in the interviews. Though one thing that was interesting is students had fairly mixed responses to the role of guided inquiry. There were some students, like the one on the left, that talked about figuring things out yourself. This student even talked about themselves as the scientist that knows everything, which suggests this student viewed guided inquiry labs as an opportunity to experience performance towards developing a physics identity. Now, on the other hand, there were students who talked about wanting more instruction, being really frustrated by not knowing exactly what to do. They also talked a little bit about this sense of isolation, when I'm left to do a lab by myself. What was really interesting is there were several individuals who expressed both these views, that sense of ownership and that opportunity to figure things out for themselves as a positive experience on their confidence, but that experience of struggling and making some missteps, that's a very natural part of guided inquiry, as something that hurt their confidence. Now, linking to the quantitative data, there's also some indication that the guided inquiry labs are important. Due to the nature of an AP course, at certain points in the year, the pace has to speed up, and so labs are more teacher-directed in order to get through all of the content in time for the AP exam. And so I was able to split up topics that were taught primarily using guided inquiry labs and topics that were taught primarily using more teacher-directed labs. Now, focusing on the gold bar, or the gold section of each bar, which represents high confidence and high achievement, and the green section of each bar, which represents low confidence but high achievement. On both the guided inquiry and the teacher-directed labs, boys and girls tended to have pretty similar levels of achievement, and there wasn't much change in the levels of achievement between those guided inquiry labs and those teacher-directed labs. However, focusing on the gold, which is high confidence and high achievement, and the red, which is overconfidence, so high confidence and low achievement, students tended to have, of both genders, tended to have lower confidence on those more teacher-directed labs. There was a much higher fraction of both boys and girls that fell into that underconfident profile, where they had high achievement but low confidence. Girls were a little less likely than boys to be overconfident after those teacher-directed labs as well. So this suggests that having that guided inquiry experience was important for these students to be able to develop some confidence. To wrap up with a few major takeaways. External recognition is an important experience for students to build confidence. In this study, only boys talked positively about peer recognition. And so a natural question is, did boys experience more peer recognition, or was there something that led them to interpret those experiences differently than the girls in the class? Teacher recognition also played an important role. Though boys connected that external recognition to demonstrations of competence, while girls were able to separate experiencing external recognition from demonstrating competence. And so that raises the question of, was there a difference in the feedback that girls and boys received, or was there something that led students to interpret that feedback differently? Guided inquiry labs were another key experience for students to develop that sense of confidence, though they had both positive and negative effects on students. On the positive side, guided inquiry labs helped students develop a sense of a science identity, and it also gave them feeling of ownership over their content knowledge, both of which students saw as leading to more confidence. But on the other hand, there were students who saw the confusion and the mistakes that are a natural part of guided inquiry as something that lowered their confidence. A few students also had a perception of a sense of isolation during guided inquiry, feeling like they didn't have supports, which again lowered their confidence. This suggests it's critical to have a classroom culture and scaffolds that will minimize these negative impacts of guided inquiry on students' confidence. If you have any questions, I would love to hear from you, and thank you for your time.